You know, this is really going to be it.
We were 6 volunteers. I'm the only one at that.
Well, it was pretty distressing.
Normandy, Dunkirk, the Ardennes, among the most crucial battles of all time. Arnhem, Monte Cassino. In World War II Revisited, we go back with soldiers who fought on both sides during those epic struggles. Men who 60 years ago were implacable enemies, but who meet now, sometimes for the first time, at the scenes of some of the most momentous battles of the Second World War. In this program, 2 English veterans and an old German soldier come face to face in the Egyptian desert wasteland of El Alamein, where many thousands of men died, but where they survived.
Brings back a lot of memories, doesn't it?
Well, it sure does. What about the civilian Marley? After all, it's your song which we've pitched, isn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Yes.
True enough.
Yes.
Yeah.
Underneath the lamp light by the barrel's flame.
Cheers again. You have a very good house. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers to us.
Today, El Alamein is an unimpressive ridge of sand, gravel and rock. A railway, a road, a tiny settlement, and little else. Yet in 1942, this was the scene of a titanic tactical battle of cat and mouse between Field Marshal Rommel and General Montgomery. Here, the Allies showed for the first time that the German army could be beaten.
I think that's the same as 59 years ago, 2 against 1.
Yes,
Normandy has 200,000 men,
Yeah,
Rommel had
yeah.
90,000 men.
That's right.
We had 300 German tanks, and the Italians had 200, but very weak tanks.
We had about 1,000.
And you had 1,000 tanks.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
7th Division, 1st Division, 10th
Sure.
Division.
Yeah. Yeah, but your tanks were much bigger than ours. And they had more armour plate on them.
Between 1940 and 1942, Britain and her Commonwealth committed every man that could be spared to the war for Northern Africa. For Hitler, North Africa may have been secondary to the battles for Europe and Russia, but for Churchill, it was no sideshow. He was determined that Allied forces would stop the Axis forces that were sweeping towards the oil-rich Middle East.
We arrived out in Egypt, it would be October, to a camp site in the desert, a mile or 2 outside Alexandria, quite near the sea.
So every morning we had a swim, and in the evening we had a swim, and during the middle of the day we had a swim. So it was lovely.
The relative luxury of these early days was soon replaced by the harsh realities of desert warfare. The first moves in a series of battles that would turn the tide of the war came in December 1940, when a small British force chased a much larger Italian army back some 500 miles, from the Egyptian border to El Agheila. It was a humiliating defeat for the Italians, who were clearly not going to win control of North Africa by themselves. Returning to El Alamein after nearly 60 years, Les Hooper and Neville Gilman remember very well the British view of the Italian army.
One of the notices near the Italian memorial, which says, we did not lack courage, we lacked good fortune, which shows they were very sensitive, I think, because the Germans regarded them as being rubbish.
The Italians were good soldiers. They were very badly equipped. And as far as the naval fleet was concerned, which had a good reputation and was quite powerful, there was often amazement in Germany that, for most of the time, it remained in the docks and rarely went into action.
The British troops had really beaten the Italian army, and they went right back beyond Benghazi, by which time the British lines of communication were very stretched. And the Germans then reinforced the Italians, sent Rommel over to take command of the whole outfit, and they then counterattacked.
This counterattack pushed the Allied forces back to Tobruk. Here, at this strategically vital port, they were subjected to a horrendous 8-month siege. It was clear to all, even the Allies, that Rommel was an innovative commander. He knew what his armies could do and had absolute confidence in his men. Alfred Stoislav was a lieutenant serving in the German 5th Tank Regiment, and he remembers the respect held for Rommel within the German ranks.
Ich habe ihn zwar nur einmal gesehen, aber ich habe gehört und mir war bekannt.
I only saw him once, but I heard and I knew that he didn't avoid any strains or hardships. He was always up at the front lines, and a commander in the field had to lead from the front in Africa, simply because the ground demanded it.
There's no doubt about it that there was these sort of joking references, what a pity we can't have Rommel running 7th Armoured Division, we do quite well, and things like that.
After the costly failure of the attempt to lift the siege of Tobruk, a second British offensive, codenamed Operation Crusader, began in November 1941. After heavy fighting, the Allies managed to break out.
Eventually, we did manage to get further on. The Germans did pull back, and in fact we then did extremely well and got right round the bulge of Libya, past Benghazi and down to the Gulf of Sirte, a place called El Agheila.
And the same thing really happened again. The lines of communication became so extended that, whereas the German lines, of course, contracted, so it was easier for them to keep supplied. And for the second time, Rommel counterattacked.
The Germans once again swept eastwards, pushing the Allies back on the defensive. In May 1942, there was a fierce fight at Gazala, during which Rommel led a spectacular advance through thick minefields. The irresistible German push continued apace, thrusting on deep into Egypt. In June 1942, the unthinkable happened. Tobruk was surrendered, and 25,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner. The Rommel legend was firmly established, and he was promoted to Field Marshal by his delighted Führer. By July 1942, however, when the German forces finally paused to draw breath, they were utterly exhausted and dangerously short of fuel, food and water. But their 800-mile advance through North Africa had left them just 80 miles from Alexandria.
Also ich denke, dass unsere Überlegenheit in den ersten
I think that our superiority in the first years, during the initial period, stemmed from the fact that the German leadership was much more flexible, more imaginative, not obstinate. They permitted and made possible considerable independence of action by commanders of the troops who were further down the chain of command.
Rommel's bold leadership was not the only reason for the German domination. As Clifford Pace explains, the German tanks were also superior to those of the Allies.
We never had parity with the German tanks, and they always had thicker armour. They were the first people to double up the thickness of the front of their tanks by bolting extra plates on. But the great thing was the penetrating power of their guns. Their tank guns had an extremely high muzzle velocity.
By contrast, the 2-pounder guns of the British Crusader tanks were simply no match in firepower.
I've just seen a Crusader.
Yeah, that's what it
Yes,
is.
yeah. Yes, that one there.
Yeah.
Oh, that's it.
Yeah, that's it.
Only
With
trouble
its-
was that
With its
gun-
pop gun,
Yeah, there's pop
which
gun,
we
yeah.
used to call it, the 2-pounder,
Yeah.
the pop gun.
Yes.
You know, that fires corks.
Yeah, very cool.
for all the use they were, they might have been corks. Yeah.
How many men were in the Crusader?
4.
Four.
Not like we've been in one.
Yeah.
What had they to do, the 4?
Well, there was a tank commander,
Yes.
the gunner,
Loader.
gunner and loader, and the gunner and the wireless operator and loader, and the driver. But actually, when you come to look at it, the Crusader tank is a very well designed thing. I mean, it's very low, isn't it?
Very
A
low.
small
Yeah.
target and
Yes,
whatnot.
yes. Low
And it was
target.
very fast too.
Yes, yes.
It went very fast, which was handy on
I
occasion.
think that was important.
Yes, yes, it was.
To be fast.
Depends which way you were
That
going.
direction was.
Of course, the conditions in which these tanks fought during the North African campaign were unlike any other theatre of battle in the Second World War.
It was like a battle at sea where the ships appear and everything that moves can be seen. And it was a similar thing with the tanks in the desert. It was a kind of battle at sea.
It was an ideal ground for operating armour and vehicles.
I mean, there's no trees, no grass, just sand and rubble. And it was so hot. It was 120 in the shade. So if you were a little bit that way inclined, you could go off the rocker.
You got used to it. Got used to sand in your sandwiches. Used to living very frugally. The worst problem was water.
Water, like every other item of supply, had to be shipped in. Petrol, ammunition and food had to be carried hundreds of miles to reach the troops.
All the people used to come and get their water. And we were supplied by a Palestinian group that brought in Bowsers. You know, they brought up thousands of gallons and put them into our support tanks. And then we fed the troop.
We only got half a ration at times. And at a very low level, we had 2 pints per man per day of water. And at the worst, it got down to 1 pint per man for all purposes, which included washing, shaving, and everything you can think of. I learnt to have a bath in a tin mug of water.
The German forces too had their supply problems that were made worse by their rapid advance into Egypt. Alfred Stoisloff explains.
If you just think of the supply lines from Germany to us in Egypt, right through Italy, that was 2,000 kilometers from Germany across the Mediterranean, which we didn't control, because the English had absolute superiority in the air, and with their overseas forces from their base on Malta. And then the materials were unloaded at Tripoli, and had another 1,000 kilometers to travel along the coast road.
Despite these supply problems, Pat Dias remembers that there was sometimes an opportunity for a surprise meal.
We were somewhere 500 miles in the desert. And up came the fitters, and one of them saw an animal loping across the desert and picked up his rifle, and he must have been a very good shot. He shot it. And the fitter's truck went over and picked it up and found it was a cheetah, not normal to the desert. So he brought it back, and my gunner was a butcher in civilian life. So he skinned it and chopped it up into chops. And that night, we had cheetah chops instead of bully beef. The next morning, early morning, a jeep arrived, and he said, "Excuse me, gentlemen, you have not seen our regimental mascot, have you?" I could feel it in my stomach.
It was the arrival of a British commander to match Rommel that signalled an upturn in Allied fortunes. General Bernard Montgomery, a tenacious and determined leader who took command of the 8th Army in August 1942, replaced Sir Claude Auchinleck.
By the time Monty came out, he had very definite ideas of how the battle should be conducted, which was a change because previously we had always been reacting to the Germans who were doing the attacking.
Where Rommel was bold, though, Montgomery was cautious, working strictly within the limitations of his army. It was perhaps his great achievement in the war that in North Africa and later in Europe, Montgomery fought to the strengths of his country's brave but inexperienced citizen armies. It wasn't long before Montgomery demonstrated his considerable leadership skills. At Alam Halfa in August 1942, he commanded the Allied forces in a heroic stand against Rommel's Afrika Korps. When Montgomery took over the 8th Army, he quickly realized it needed rest, retraining, and resupply. So he decided that when Rommel's forces made their next assault, the 8th Army would not attempt to counterattack. It would fight entirely on the defensive in order to repel them.
Undoubtedly, at the time that Montgomery came out there, morale was very poor. I mean, it's documented that there were all sorts of plans and people sort of evacuating and all that sort of thing. And then Monty came out and more or less said there would be no retreat. We stand here and fight, and if necessary, we die.
Montgomery chose to make his stand because he knew that the terrain made it impossible for Rommel to carry out his favorite attacking maneuver, a long outflanking hook southward into the desert, and then around and behind the Allied positions. 40 miles south of El Alamein lay the Great Katara Depression, a huge area of soft sand that was impassable even for Rommel's army. Rommel's hook this time would have to be much shorter, and it would therefore be easier to defend. Montgomery secretly laid dense minefields in front of the British lines. A strong British force was concealed on and beside the Alam Halfa Ridge, which lay halfway down the British positions. Rommel thrust against the south of the Allied positions, employing the cream of his army, the 21st and 15th Panzer Divisions.
Plan was drawn up that at a place called Alam Halfa, that the big stand would be made, and they dug in the tanks. They had to dig them in, and so that they were what's known as hull-down position. That's the bottom of the tank was covered, and just the turret looking over the top. And all fairly dramatic instructions, you will stay there, there will be no withdrawals, and you will fight to the last.
As the thick minefields and strong Allied resistance along the Alam Halfa Ridge slowed their advance, Rommel tried to find a gap between it and the New Zealand Division, but their repeated attacks were met with murderous Allied defensive fire. After 3 days' hard fighting, Rommel recognized that a breakthrough was impossible and began slowly to withdraw his army. By the 7th of September 1942, all fighting in the area had ended. General Montgomery had won the first defensive battle of the campaign and had demonstrated that Rommel's armies could be beaten. Now he had to prepare his army for the much more difficult task of attacking the German forces, and to achieve that, the 8th Army required vast improvements in equipment, leadership, and tactics. New and better equipment was on the way. A huge convoy had just arrived with 300 new American Sherman tanks to join the 200 Grant tanks already received from America. These gave Montgomery an excellent force of tanks armed with 75mm guns.
I was never in a Sherman myself. They only arrived, just
fairly new,
sort of a month or so before the battle started. Well, before Alamein started.
Yes.
And in fact, we hadn't got any Shermans until much later on.
We were in the 7th Division.
Yes, we had quite a number of Grants just before the Battle of Alamein.
Yes, yes.
But until then, the biggest thing that we had was the Churchill.
Montgomery also knew that he could count on the Allied air power. Alfred Stoyshoff recalls his encounters with the famous British Spitfire.
I think these bloody things were hunting on us on the highway.
Yeah.
Very dangerous for us. Yeah. And I think these aeroplanes were equal to our May 109.
Yes.
I think that were the best hunting flyers in the war. And they were hunting me in the Mediterranean.
Yes.
From Malta, coming from Malta with Beaufighters and Beauforts.
Yes. Yeah.
And they succeeded to let us go down to the ground of the Mediterranean.
Although hundreds of new 6-pounder anti-tank guns also arrived to replace the inadequate 2-pounders, these were still no match for the German 88mm anti-tank guns. Even now, Neville Gilman still shudders at the memory. He was too often at the receiving end of their power.
Oh, yeah, I didn't like
terrible
nasty things like our Spitfires. Yes, we didn't think much of them. They were converted anti-aircraft guns. The Germans used them in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. And the story is that an anti-aircraft battery, a German anti-aircraft battery in Spain, was attacked by some tanks, and they managed to lower the thing. They were in a position where they could lower the things and use these anti-aircraft guns to fire at the tanks. And they found if they hit them, they just blew the tanks to pieces. They're enormous things, colossal muzzle velocity and whatnot.
The 88mm gun was something that once heard, you never forgot it. It went across the top of the tank, if you were lucky, with a sound like a whiplash.
If you stood in a railway station and an intercity express has gone past at 100 miles an hour, that was the sort of noise there was going over the top.
I bailed out 3 times and got away with it. We had a sergeant who bailed out of 15 tanks and got away with it. The unlucky ones were the lucky ones were the ones who were hit and killed outright. The unlucky ones were the ones who were wounded and couldn't get out when the tank burned. That was the worst scenario of all.
I looked at the one tank and the man's head was about that big.
Oh, I know, yes. If they caught fire, they just shrank, Yes.
There's not often much left when they burned out. It was a horrible death, though.
In an ideal world, Montgomery would have had time to train his replacement troops and make the new equipment desert-worthy. But during this crucial phase of the Desert War, time was short. There were pressing problems away from the battlefield. Malta was in dire need of a relief convoy, which could only sail if and when Britain controlled the airfields in Libya. The plan for Operation Torch, the secret Anglo-American invasion of French North Africa, planned for early November, had met with resistance from the French themselves, and an Allied victory in Egypt was badly needed in order to persuade French forces to cooperate with the landings. From London, Churchill insisted on an early attack, but Montgomery would not be swayed. He knew full well that outright victory was within his reach. Montgomery was fully aware of the task that awaited his men. He expected a week-long battle and that there would be some 10,000 Allied casualties. The reward, though, would be to hit Rommel for 6 right out of Africa. Two huge German minefields, known to the Allies as January and February, lay between the opposing forces.
There were minefields all the way down here. Two of them, 2 lines.
I heard one number that Rommel had the time during nothing was to do.
Yes.
I heard we had 500,000 mines. 500,000 and this 60 kilometers.
Yes.
Those same deadly minefields still claim victims to this very day. Only now it's not British soldiers who become casualties, but innocent local people. Some of these unfortunate souls showed their terrible wounds to our cameraman, providing harrowing evidence of what an exploding mine does to a human being. Although Rommel knew that a British offensive would come, he had no way of knowing the place or the time. With hindsight, it's perhaps extraordinary that, seeking to improve his increasingly poor health, the Field Marshal went on leave to the Alps. To convince the Germans that the attack would come to the south of El Alamein, the Allies carried out elaborate deceptions.
Our job, the 7th Armoured Division job, was to act as a feint attack down in the south.
We saw these large numbers of dummy tanks which our people were dotting about all over the place, most elaborate camouflaged formations were brought up and put in position overnight. Dummy water pipelines were put in position, all with the idea of defeating the German reconnaissance planes.
The real plan was to attack in the north at night. The Allied troops were ordered to break through the deep German defences and then wait for tanks to follow them in. These would begin their attack after the infantry, with sappers clearing lanes for them through the thick German minefields.
So it came to the 23rd of October, and Monty issued his great order of the day. His was the famous one, when I came out, I said we were going to kick Rommel for 6 out of Egypt, and this is what we're going to do tonight, and let no man fight while he is still unwounded, and quite sort of dramatic thing. It boosted the adrenaline a bit. I mean, it was a bit frightening. You say, my God, this is really going to be it.
4 Allied infantry divisions were soon advancing on a 10-mile front. The decisive battle for North Africa had begun.
We advanced through our own minefield, and as we set off, we all had to coordinate our watches and so on. And the precise moment that we set off, the artillery barrage started from behind us. 1,500 guns opened up all at once. I mean, it was a fantastic experience and very heartening, because you thought, this is going to keep them quiet.
Ja, es war ein Riesenfeuerwerk.
The fireworks were massive. I had never seen the like of it before. It wasn't quite light, and there was just a wall of flashes and smoke in front of us.
As the Allied troops encountered the main German line of defence, the attack faltered. They were met by murderous machine gun fire as they pressed home their attack through the deep minefields.
There was so much small arms fire. We think the Germans were using machine guns firing on fixed lines as well as firing anti-tank shells. This machine gun fire, which was tracer and could be seen quite easily, was coming along probably no more than 4 or possibly 5 feet above the ground. So I lost sight of the others at that moment. I got down on my hands and knees and I finished the crawl back to the gap between the minefields on my hands and knees. I reckon I must have crawled probably half a mile or something like that. Anyway, with a bit of luck, I managed to make it.
During the bitter and confused fighting, 2 divisions, the Australian and New Zealand, reached their objective. But try as they might, 2 others stopped short. Unsure of their position, and with dawn approaching, there was little option. The Allied troops dug in to await the arrival of the tanks. They were to have a long wait.
There had been delays because we'd only got 2 lanes had been made through the minefield instead of 4, and everything got bunched up and so on. So by the time we got through, it was beginning to get daylight. So they decided we couldn't go through the second minefield as had been planned. So we spent the next day in between the 2 minefields. My tank was still a runner, but one after the other, the tanks went off the air. And I managed to get myself between 2 knocked out tanks, so I had a bit of shelter.
Montgomery rapidly changed the battle plan, and the 4 infantry divisions who had fought so hard and had taken so many casualties were rested. The new plan called for the 1st Armoured Division to attack by itself on a much narrower front towards Kidney Ridge. By using its own infantry brigades together with its tanks, it was hoped some of the confusion of the earlier fighting would be avoided. Meanwhile, Rommel returned to the desert to take command and immediately launched an attack by the 21st and 15th Panzer Divisions, along with 2 Italian infantry divisions.
At the beginning, the main attack took place in the north, and that's where the first incursions were made. And when that became clear to Rommel, he tried to bring up forces from his southern flank to the coast. I was among them, with the 21st Tank Division, to which the 5th Tank Regiment belonged.
A ferocious battle developed around Kidney Ridge. Neville Gilman and Clifford Pace recall the fighting on the front line that day.
We were supposed to form a bridgehead the other side of the second minefield, and they were already waiting for us when we got there. And one by one, the tanks either ran over unidentified mines or were hit by the German anti-tank guns. But one after the other, the tanks went off the air.
You were hearing those usual words that Charlie 5 has brewed or Charlie 2 has had it, and you automatically registered who that was. But you really didn't have time to worry too much about things like that.
The savage fighting around Kidney Ridge was the first occasion in the war that serious losses were inflicted on the once all-powerful German armour, although the German guns, too, took their toll.
There was a tremendous, you could call it a tremendous thump, I suppose. And at the same time, a noise of tearing armour plate. Most peculiar. All this happened simultaneously. The shell had come in and it exploded, and there was absolutely deathly silence after the explosion. There was nothing at all. The two crew must have been killed instantly. I mean, the force of the explosion, which had blown the side of the tank out, it was sticking up in the air. I realised my leg was broken because it was sticking out at a very peculiar angle that it could never have done otherwise. And by that time, the ammunition, which was stacked in a rack round the top of the turret, was beginning to burn. And I realised I must get myself up pretty smartish. And I managed to haul myself up on the gun mounting and onto the top of the gun, and then out onto the top of the turret. And I thought, well, it won't do me any good to jump with a broken leg. So I lined myself up and rolled off the top. And I sat there for about 10 minutes, and I heard some vehicles moving, so I heaved myself up and shouted. And it was a platoon of infantry. I think they had a Bren carrier and a couple of 1,500 weight trucks. And this young officer came over, and I said, look, you know, my leg's bust. Can you put me on one of your vehicles? And so he took me back.
2 nights later, the Australians attacked northwards towards the sea to take control of the coastal road. This was one of Montgomery's classic battle plans, varying the point of attack and keeping the enemy unbalanced and unsure. The attack stretched the German defences, forcing Rommel to commit his last trusted formation, the 90th Light Division, to the battle. The once irrepressible Field Marshal Rommel became deeply pessimistic at the prospects for an Axis victory. To add to his woes, Montgomery was now planning Operation Supercharge, the final thrust that would win the battle. Montgomery planned an attack in tandem. The Australians would push on again in the north to weaken the Germans, and then the New Zealanders, pulling out of the line and repositioned, would strike through them to break out along the coastal road. Fresh brigades were to be committed to support the New Zealanders in order to maintain the pace of the attack. The Germans would therefore be pushed westward, away from the road, and into the desert. At 2 a.m. on the 2nd of November, the Australians made their attack in the north, followed as planned by the New Zealanders, who were supported by British infantry and armoured brigades. The fighting went on for 3 days and nights, and at first it followed a familiar pattern of stalemate. Most of the Allied tanks could not get through to support the infantry. Eventually, though, after very heavy fighting, there was enough armour to reduce the Afrika Korps to only 35 operational tanks. On the 3rd of November, Rommel sent a signal to Hitler announcing his intention to save the remainder of his army by retreating.
Soweit wie mir bekannt, hatte Rommel einen Lagerbericht nach Berlin oder ins
Rommel sent a situation report to Berlin, or to the Wolfschanze headquarters, with the request that he should be allowed to initiate a withdrawal. The request was refused, whereupon Rommel said, "All right, I'm a soldier, I have to obey."
Of course, the Führer's dramatic order made little difference, because most of the Afrika Korps was now fighting for its life, or to find a way of escape. The final act came on the 4th of November, when the German and Italian forces began a rapid and totally shambolic retreat to the west.
Ja, der Rückzug litt vor allen Dingen unter Fahrzeugmangel.
The retreat suffered above all from lack of vehicles. We were not all motorized in Africa, and the infantry had to be taken back on the retreat too. The Great Retreat, which covered about 1,000 kilometers from the front lines at Alamein up to Tripoli. And fuel was scarce. There was no more ammunition, and of course, The repair workshops had already been closed down long before in order to retreat, so that it was hardly possible to carry out maintenance on broken down vehicles or tanks.
Under Montgomery's command, a decisive and momentous Allied victory had been achieved, but the cost in Allied lives had been heavy, with nearly 14,000 troops killed or wounded.
I know always when you got into Liga, into a formation at night, close formation in the desert, if you could, you used to walk around and ask for news of people, and when you were told that they hadn't made it, well, it was pretty distressing. Yes, I think that would be a fair comment on it.
Our cameras followed Les Hooper around the El Alamein war cemetery as he searched for the grave of one of his former comrades.
What I was looking for was a name of a chap whose body was never found. But, I mean, we could walk up and down here for hours. They probably had their caught fire or burned out or whatever, and that had an identity on them. All these sort of things happened during the war. Probably just depending where they were found and how long they've been there, rotted away perhaps. The ants eat it. The ants were good cleaners. There's one unknown.
"50,000 men of the Africa Corps, half their number, had been killed, wounded or captured. It was not until the Germans had retreated westward, some 1,500 miles out of Egypt and almost out of Libya, that they were able to regroup and reorganize themselves. With the Operation Torch landings in French Northern Africa on the 8th of November, the clearing of all German forces out of Africa was now only a matter of time. The victory at El Alamein was one of the great turning points of World War II, a triumph that allowed Churchill to remark, "Before El Alamein, we never had a victory. Afterwards, we never had a defeat." In his twilight years, Bernard Montgomery revisited the battlefield with which his name will be forever linked, but it was a very different Montgomery to the man who had fought so hard during 1942. As he gazed upon the seemingly endless rows of British white crosses, the old warrior declined the opportunity to visit the Italian and German cemeteries that also stand on the battlefield. "I think," he said, "I've been responsible for enough deaths without seeing those too."
When we say these few words, let us include in our remembrance the thousands and thousands on the other side who also perished, and some of whose friends are with us today. They shall grow not old, as we who are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. We will remember them.
There were 6 volunteers. I'm the only one that left. Yeah. Yes, I was lucky. Oh, well, that's life, isn't it?